The silence of the house used to be the hardest thing for Brian to bear after Mia died. But tonight, amidst the deafening screams of a colicky newborn, he would have traded his soul for just one moment of peace. He just never expected that peace to be delivered by 4 paws and a heart that seemed far too human to be a dog's. The red digits on the bedside clock glared at Brian like a judgment. In the crib, 3-week-old Leo was screaming, a high-pitched, jagged sound that felt like it was sawing directly through Brian's last remaining nerve ending. Brian sat on the edge of the mattress, his head in his hands. The room smelled like sour milk and talcum powder, a scent that used to make him smile when he and Mia were painting the nursery yellow, dreaming of the future. Now the smell just made him want to retch. He stood up, his knees cracking audibly in the quiet room. He was 32, but tonight he felt 80. His reflection in the hallway mirror caught him off guard as he shuffled toward the crib. Dark purple bruises under his eyes, a stubble that had gone past rugged into neglected, and a t-shirt stained with spit-up. "Shh, Leo. Come on, buddy. Please," Brian whispered, his voice cracking. He reached down and scooped the infant up. Leo was hot, his little face contorted into a mask of pure red fury. His tiny fists punched the air, fighting an invisible enemy that Brian couldn't protect him from. Brian began the bounce, the rhythmic sway that the nurses had taught him. Up, down, pat the back, shh, near the ear. Nothing worked. The screaming escalated, bouncing off the walls of the empty house. In the corner of the room, in the shadows cast by the dim nightlight, sat Milo. The 3-year-old golden retriever hadn't moved for hours. Usually, Milo was a ball of chaotic energy, greeting guests with a tail that acted like a whip and a tongue that didn't know the meaning of personal space. But since the day Brian came home from the hospital with a car seat but no wife, Milo had changed. The dog sat rigid, his golden fur catching the sliver of moonlight. His dark, soulful eyes tracked Brian's every movement. He didn't bark at the baby's cries. He didn't whine to go out. He just watched, with a gaze that felt heavy, almost critical. "I know, Milo," Brian snapped, the lack of sleep stripping away his filter. "I know I'm doing a bad job. You don't have to stare at me like that." Milo didn't flinch. He just tilted his head slightly to the left, his ears perked forward. Brian paced the length of the nursery. He looked at the framed photo on the dresser. Mia, laughing at their baby shower, her hand resting on her swollen belly. She looked so capable, so ready. She had read every book. She knew exactly how this was supposed to go. "I miss you, Mia," Brian choked out, tears finally pricking his eyes, mixing with the sweat on his face. "I don't think I can do this. He hates me. I can't make him stop." The isolation was a physical weight. It wasn't just the lack of sleep. It was the crushing reality that there was no one to tag in. There was no voice from the other room saying, "Honey, let me take him for a bit." There was just the screaming baby, the judging clock, and the silent dog. Brian's arms trembled. His muscles were burning from holding Leo for 4 hours straight. He felt a wave of dizziness hit him, the room spinning slightly. He gripped the edge of the changing table to steady himself, terrified he might drop the only piece of Mia he had left. Before we continue to the moment that changed everything, I want to ask, for those of you who have raised children or supported someone who did, what was the one thing that got you through those sleepless nights? Was it a specific routine, a person, or just sheer willpower? Let me know in the comments below. He looked down at Leo. The baby was gasping now, choking on his own cries. He felt a surge of panic. Is he sick? Is something wrong? Am I missing a sign? He needed water. He needed to sit down before he fell down. "Okay, Leo, okay. We're going to the living room," Brian murmured. He shuffled out of the nursery, his feet dragging on the carpet. Behind him, the soft click-clack of claws on wood followed. Milo was right on his heels, a golden shadow refusing to leave his side. Brian made it to the living room sofa and collapsed. He laid Leo on his chest, praying the heartbeat-to-heartbeat contact would soothe the boy. For a second, Leo quieted, and the silence was loud. It hurt. But then, the baby arched his back, let out a fresh, piercing wail, and the cycle began again. Brian closed his eyes, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I can't," he whispered to the empty room. "I literally can't do this anymore." His grip loosened. His body, shutting down from 72 hours of near-zero sleep, began to drift into a dangerous gray fog. He was fading, his consciousness slipping away despite the screaming. And that was when he felt the weight shift on the sofa. The springs creaked. A wet nose nudged his limp hand. Milo had climbed up, but he wasn't curling up to sleep. Brian's consciousness flickered like a dying light bulb. He knew he shouldn't sleep. He knew it was dangerous to hold Leo while drifting off, but his body had staged a mutiny. His chin dropped to his chest, his arms went slack, and the protective cradle he had formed around his son loosened dangerously. Leo, sensing the loss of security, inhaled sharply, preparing for a scream that would likely shatter windows. But the scream never came. Through the heavy fog of exhaustion, Brian felt movement. It wasn't the jerky, frantic kicking of the baby. It was heavy, deliberate, and warm. Milo had climbed fully onto the sofa. This was strictly against house rules. Mia had been adamant about no dogs on the furniture, but Milo didn't care about rules tonight. He moved with a stealth that defied his 80-pound frame, inching forward until his golden chest pressed against Brian's side. Brian's arm, heavy as lead, slipped off Leo's back. In that split second, the infant was vulnerable, balanced precariously on Brian's heaving chest. Milo didn't hesitate. The dog extended his front paws, not with the playful clumsiness he used for tennis balls, but with a surgical precision. He slid one large, furry paw under Leo's tiny, flailing legs, and the other gently over the baby's chest. He didn't pull the baby away. He pulled himself around the baby. Milo curled his massive body into a tight C shape, creating a living, breathing barrier between the infant and the edge of the sofa. He essentially became a nest, but it was what he did next that defied everything Brian understood about canine behavior. Leo whimpered, his face scrunching up, ready to launch into another fit. Milo lowered his large, blocky head. He didn't lick the baby's face. Instead, he rested his chin gently on the baby's diapered stomach, applying a soft, steady pressure. It was the exact amount of weight needed to ground the infant, a technique the nurses called deep pressure therapy, usually reserved for occupational therapists, not golden retrievers. Then, Milo began to breathe. He didn't pant. He took deep, rhythmic, audible breaths. In and out. In and out. The rise and fall of the dog's chest against Leo's tiny body created a rocking motion, a biological cradle that mimicked the sensation of the womb. Brian jerked awake 10 minutes later, his heart hammering against his ribs. The panic hit him instantly. "The baby! I fell asleep. Where is he?" "Leo!" he gasped, his hands scrambling. He froze. The room was silent. The silence was so absolute, it felt heavy. Brian blinked his eyes, adjusting to the gloom of the living room. He looked down, and the air rushed back into his lungs. They were exactly where they had been 6 hours earlier. Milo was still curled in that protective C shape, his golden coat acting as a wall between the baby and the floor. Leo was awake, blinking up at the ceiling, his tiny hands batting at Milo's whiskers. Every time Leo's hand struck the dog's snout, Milo didn't flinch. He just licked the baby's fingers, a gentle, deliberate rasp of his tongue that made Leo coo. Brian sank back on the coffee table, burying his face in his hands. He felt a strange cocktail of emotions: relief, gratitude, and a crushing wave of guilt. I slept. I let a dog babysit my newborn son because I was too weak to stay awake. But as the days turned into weeks, the guilt began to fade, replaced by a bewildered awe. Milo wasn't just a pet anymore. He had promoted himself to partner. The transformation was subtle at first, then undeniable. When Brian prepared bottles in the kitchen, Milo would trot in, sit, and watch the water temperature. If the kettle whistled too loud, Milo would bark a sharp single warning. Quiet down, he's sleeping. When it was tummy time, Milo would lie parallel to Leo, offering his own fluffy flank as a prop so the baby wouldn't roll onto the hardwood. But it was the nights that defied explanation. Brian stopped setting alarms. He didn't need them. At the first shift in Leo's breathing, before the baby even let out a cry, Milo would appear at Brian's bedside. He wouldn't bark. He would simply nudge Brian's hanging hand with a wet nose. "He's up," the nudge said. "Your turn." It was a rhythm, a partnership, and for the first time since the funeral, the house didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a home again, albeit a strange one. However, the outside world wasn't ready to understand. 3 weeks later, the doorbell rang. It was Eleanor, Mia's mother. She came by every Tuesday, bringing casseroles and a heavy, suffocating cloud of shared grief. "Brian, it smells like dog in here," Eleanor said, as she stepped into the hallway, her nose wrinkling. She was a sharp woman, always perfectly put together, her pain hidden behind layers of foundation and stiff hairspray. "I haven't had time to vacuum, El. It's been a rough month." "Well, where is my grandson?" She walked past him into the living room. Brian froze. He knew what she was going to see. Leo was in his bassinet, but he wasn't alone. Milo was standing on his hind legs, his front paws resting gently on the rim of the bassinet, his head dipped inside, sniffing the baby's hair. "Oh my God!" Eleanor shrieked, dropping her purse. "Brian, get that animal away from him!" Milo didn't startle. He slowly turned his head, fixing Eleanor with a calm, almost bored gaze. He didn't back down. He simply put himself between the woman and the bassinet, his body language shifting from nurturer to guard. "Eleanor, stop," Brian said, stepping between them. "He's fine. Milo is helping." "Helping?" Eleanor's voice pitched up, trembling with indignation. "It is a predator, Brian, a beast with teeth. You are grieving, I understand that. You're not thinking straight. But leaving Mia's baby at the mercy of a dog?" "He's not just a dog," Brian snapped, surprising himself with the ferocity of his tone. "He's the only reason Leo is sleeping. He's the only reason I'm sleeping. He watches him, Eleanor, better than I do sometimes." Eleanor looked at him with a mixture of pity and horror. "You're replacing her," she whispered, the cruelty of the words unintentional but razor-sharp. "You can't handle doing this alone, so you're letting the dog play mother. It's sick, Brian. It's dangerous." She left 10 minutes later, the casserole untouched on the counter. Brian stood in the hallway shaking. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Was he crazy? Was he endangering his son because he was too desperate for help? He walked back to the bassinet. Milo was back in position, chin resting on the rim, eyes glued to the sleeping infant. "Are you dangerous, buddy?" Brian asked softly. Milo looked up. His eyes were a deep, liquid brown. In them, Brian didn't see a predator. He saw a depth of empathy that felt ancient. The dog leaned forward and pressed his forehead against Brian's thigh, letting out a heavy exhale. It was a gesture Mia used to do when Brian was stressed, resting her head on his shoulder, breathing out the tension. Brian froze. The hair on his arms stood up. "Mia?" he whispered, the name slipping out before logic could catch it. Milo held the contact for a second longer, then trotted back to the nursery as if to say, "Don't be silly, but I'm here." This is a heavy moment. Eleanor thinks Brian is being irresponsible, while Brian feels Milo is a godsend. Who do you side with here? Is it dangerous to let a large dog be so close to a newborn, or do animals possess an instinct that we should trust? Tell me your verdict in the comments. The weeks blurred into months. Leo grew heavier, his colic fading, replaced by the gummy smiles of a 3-month-old. The bond between the trio solidified. But the peace was fragile. It happened on a Tuesday evening. A storm was rolling in, the pressure dropping rapidly. The sky was a bruised purple, and the wind was whipping the oak trees against the siding. Leo had been fussy all day. Not the screaming colic fussiness, but a low whining grumble. He checked his temperature, 98.6, normal. He checked his diaper, clean. He fed him. "He's just reacting to the weather," Brian told Milo, who was pacing the nursery floor in tight, anxious circles. Usually, Milo was the picture of zen. Tonight, he was frantic. He kept whining, a high-pitched, persistent sound that grated on Brian's nerves. He would trot to the crib, sniff Leo, trot to Brian, nudge his leg, and run back to the crib. "Milo, stop it," Brian said, rubbing his temples. "He's fine. I just checked him." Milo didn't stop. He jumped up, placing his paws on the crib railing, and yelled a sharp bark. "Down!" Brian commanded, his patience snapping. "Get out! Go to your bed!" Milo dropped to all fours, but he didn't leave. He looked at Brian, then back at the baby, and did something he had never done before. He growled. It wasn't aggressive. It was urgent, a guttural, rumbling warning. Brian stopped halfway to the door. He turned around. "What is wrong with you?" Milo ran to the crib, grabbed the hem of the blanket hanging over the side, and yanked it. "Hey!" Brian rushed forward to stop the dog from waking the baby. But when he reached the crib, he saw it. In the dim light of the nursery, Leo's face was a strange, dusty color. His chest wasn't moving. The rhythmic rise and fall that Brian had gotten used to, it was gone. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the silence of the grave. "Leo?" Brian's voice was a strangled gasp. He reached into the crib. Leo was burning hot. Not warm, but radiating heat like a furnace. And he wasn't breathing. The world narrowed down to the crib. The storm outside, the wind howling against the siding, it all vanished. There was only the terrible stillness of Leo's chest. "Leo! Leo, wake up!" Brian screamed, grabbing his son. The baby was limp, his head lolling back like a rag doll, his skin a terrifying shade of gray-blue against the white sheets. Brian's mind went blank. Every parenting book, every CPR class he'd taken with Mia, it all evaporated. Panic was a white noise, static in his brain. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers shaking so violently he dropped it on the carpet. "Ambulance! I need an ambulance!" But before he could even bend down to retrieve the phone, a golden blur shoved him aside. Milo didn't just nudge Brian, he body-checked him. The 80-pound dog slammed into Brian's hip, knocking him back against the dresser. "Milo, get back!" Brian roared, panic turning into rage. "Not now!" Milo ignored him. The dog reared up on his hind legs, his front paws landing heavily on the mattress, right next to Leo's silent form. "No!" Brian screamed, the sound tearing from his throat. But Milo lowered his head.
He placed his wet nose directly on Leo's neck, right over the carotid artery. He held it there for a split second, checking for a pulse that Brian had been too panicked to find. Then, the dog did the impossible. Milo lifted his head and let out a sharp, concussive bark directly over Leo's chest. Woof! The sound was deafening in the small room. It wasn't a warning bark. It was a command. Leo didn't move. Milo did it again. He nudged Leo's ribcage hard with his snout, a forceful, rhythmic shove. Thump! And then another bark. Woof! It was CPR. Primitive, canine, desperate CPR. The dog was trying to startle the baby's system, to jar the stopped heart back into rhythm with pure sonic force and physical pressure. Brian stood frozen, his hand outstretched, witnessing something that felt sacred and terrifying. He realized with a jolt that Milo wasn't attacking, he was resuscitating. "Come on, Leo," Brian whispered, tears blurring his vision. "Listen to him." Milo gave one final frantic shove with his nose, burying his snout into the baby's soft stomach, and let out a whine that sounded like a human sob. Gasp! The sound was wet and ragged, like a drowning man breaking the surface. Leo's back arched. His tiny arms flew out in the Moro reflex. A second later, the gray lips flushed pink, and a wail, loud, angry, and undeniably alive, erupted from the crib. Brian collapsed to his knees. The relief was so intense it was nauseating. He grabbed the railing of the crib, pulling himself up, sobbing uncontrollably. "He's crying!" Brian choked out, laughing and crying at the same time. "Oh my God, he's crying!" Leo was screaming now, a beautiful, furious sound. His face was red, his chest heaving. He was alive. Milo didn't celebrate. The moment the baby started crying, the dog's demeanor changed instantly. He dropped to all fours, his legs trembling. He looked at Brian, then at the baby, and let out a long, shaky exhale. The dog walked over to Brian, who was still clinging to the crib, and licked the tears off his cheek. One lick, rough, warm, and grounding. "I told you," the lick seemed to say. "I've got us." Brian grabbed the dog's neck, burying his face in the golden fur. He smelled like wet dog and dust, but to Brian, in that moment, it was the scent of salvation. "Thank you," Brian whispered into the fur. "Thank you, Milo." The paramedics arrived 10 minutes later. Brian had called them the second Leo started breathing again. The living room was a flurry of activity, EMTs with bags, radios crackling, the storm still raging outside. They checked Leo's vitals, their faces serious. It was likely a febrile seizure. His temperature spiked rapidly. It can cause them to stop breathing for a moment. It's terrifying, but he's stable now. You're lucky you caught it so fast. Brian looked over at the corner of the room. Milo was sitting there, watching the strangers with a guarded expression. "I didn't catch it," Brian said softly. "He did." The paramedic looked at the dog, then back at Brian, a skeptical eyebrow raised. "The dog?" "He knew before I did. He woke him up." The paramedic paused and then smiled, a tired, knowing smile. "We hear stories like that sometimes. They know things we don't, man. You got a guardian angel in a fur coat there." as the ambulance crew packed up to leave, telling Brian to monitor the fever, but that Leo would be fine. The front doors swung open. Eleanor stood there, drenched from the rain, her face pale. She had seen the ambulance lights from down the street. "Brian, is he—" She couldn't finish the sentence. She looked at the empty stretcher, then at Brian holding a sleeping Leo. "He's okay, Elle," Brian said, his voice steady. "He had a seizure. He stopped breathing." Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God, you were all alone!" "No," Brian said, looking at the golden retriever sitting stoically by his feet. "This dog saved his life, Eleanor. He literally barked the life back into him."
Eleanor looked at the dog she had called a beast just weeks ago. She looked at Milo's calm eyes, the way he was leaning against Brian's leg, offering support. The judgment in her face crumbled, replaced by a profound, stunned silence. She slowly lowered herself to one knee, ruining her pristine trousers on the floor she had criticized. She extended a trembling hand. Milo hesitated, then stepped forward and gently sniffed her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. 1 year later. The late afternoon sun poured into the living room, turning the dust motes into dancing gold. The same room where Brian had once sat in the dark, convinced his life was over. But today, the room was loud. "Go on, Leo! You got it!" Brian clapped his hands, sitting on the carpet. Leo, now a sturdy, determined 1-year-old with his mother's determined chin, wobbled on unsteady legs. He was trying to cross the vast expanse of the rug to reach the toy box. He took one step, swayed dangerously, and squeezed his eyes shut, expecting the fall. But he didn't fall. Milo was there. The golden retriever paced perfectly alongside the toddler, his body acting as a moving guardrail. When Leo tipped too far to the left, he bumped into Milo's soft flank. Milo didn't budge. He simply braced his legs, letting the boy use him as a fuzzy leaning post to regain his balance. Leo grabbed a fistful of golden fur, a grip that would have annoyed any other dog, and pulled himself upright. Milo just wagged his tail, a slow, rhythmic thump-thump against the floor. "He's walking, Brian! Look at him!" Brian turned to the kitchen doorway. Eleanor stood there, holding a tray of lemonade. She looked younger than she had a year ago. The sharp edges of her grief had softened, smoothed down by the undeniable joy of watching life continue. And she wasn't just holding lemonade. Tucked under her arm was a bag of premium butcher shop dog treats. "I see him, Elle," Brian smiled, watching the duo. "He's got the best instructor in the world." Eleanor walked over and set the tray down. She broke off a piece of a treat and held it out. Milo gently disengaged from Leo, trotted over, took the treat with the manners of a gentleman, and immediately returned to his post beside the toddler. "I was wrong, Eleanor said quietly, watching the dog. "About everything. You were scared. We all were." "No," she shook her head. "I was angry. I was angry that Mia wasn't here to do this, and I didn't want to believe that—" She trailed off, her eyes misty. "That she could still be looking out for us," Brian finished for her. Eleanor looked at him, then at Milo. "He has her eyes, Brian. I know it sounds crazy. It's a dog, but sometimes when he looks at me, I feel like she's telling me to stop worrying." Brian nodded. He knew exactly what she meant. He remembered the nights when the loneliness felt like a physical weight, and Milo would simply rest his head on Brian's knee, anchoring him to the earth. He remembered the breath of life, that impossible moment when a dog knew more about survival than the doctors. Leo finally made it to the toy box. He squealed in triumph, grabbing a stuffed bear. He turned around beaming and hugged Milo around the neck,
burying his face in the ruff of fur. Milo closed his eyes and leaned into the hug, his expression one of pure, unadulterated contentment. They weren't just a widower, a baby, and a pet. They were a pack. A strange, cobbled-together family welded tight by loss and saved by instinct. That night, after Eleanor had gone home and Leo was sound asleep, guardrailed by pillows, though Milo still slept on the rug beside the crib, Brian walked into his bedroom. He picked up the framed photo of Mia on the dresser. For a long time, looking at it had brought nothing but pain. Tonight, it brought a quiet peace. "You'd love him, Mia," Brian whispered to the glass. "He's barely walking, and he's already trying to run the house. And you were right about Milo. You were always right." He set the photo down and turned off the lamp. As he settled into bed, he felt the familiar weight settle at the foot of the mattress. The springs creaked, a heavy sigh echoed in the dark. Brian reached down with his foot, finding the warm, solid presence of the dog. Milo nudged back. The silence of the house wasn't empty anymore. It was full. It was safe. And for the first time in a long time, Brian closed his eyes and slept without a single dream of falling. He knew that if he did, someone would be there to catch him. The bond between Brian, Leo, and Milo reminds us that help doesn't always look the way we expect it to. Sometimes guardian angels don't have wings. They have 4 paws, wet noses, and a heart big enough to hold a broken family together. Brian learned that while he could never replace Mia, he didn't have to survive her loss alone. Love, it turns out, is a universal language, one that Milo spoke fluently. It's often said that dogs are man's best friend, but in this story, Milo was a father, a nurse, and a savior. Do you believe that our lost loved ones can send us signs or protection through the animals in our lives? I'd be honored to read your thoughts and personal experiences in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, please like and share it with someone who loves their dog as much as Brian loves Milo.